Okay, I'm just going to start just now. I was giving everyone a few minutes there just to join us. So I'd like to thank you for coming along today to our Zoom event for Cassiltoun Homes by the Park on behalf of Cassiltoun Housing Association. So my name is Cathy Houston. I am an architect at Collective Architecture. I'll be handing over to our client shortly to do an introduction, but before I do so, just a few procedural points. This event is kicking off 7 o'clock roughly. It should only last about 30 to 40 minutes maximum. We're going to see how we get on with the slides. As this is webinar format, only the panel and the presenter will be visible and audible throughout. We will be making a recording of this event in audio and video, as we're required to do it by planning, and we'll make this available on the website. So we're required to take a note of any comments. So if anyone uses the Q&A bar at all, that would be useful for us. However, it's just to let you know that this will be in accordance with the data protection regulations. So we will not be holding any personal details after the event. We would encourage everyone to visit the website. That's www.homesbythepark.com, where you'll find lots of useful information here. And if you'd like to be kept informed, you can add your name to the mailing list. And also, if at any point you would like to get in touch direct, we do actually have a direct email address, and it's comments@homesbythepark.com. This email address will be monitored throughout the event, so if anyone has any comments, feel free to drop us a line. And finally, we hope you enjoy this event. We're incredibly grateful for your time joining us today. As you'll see, the development site has so much potential, so many opportunities. Consultation is a big part of what we do at Collective Architecture, and we're focused on approaching this with an open mind, ready to listen, hear your views, and together with Cassiltoun Housing Association, we'd like to shape this in a way that integrates and is of benefit to the wider community as a whole. So I'd like to hand over quickly to Claire Malpaz of Cassiltoun Housing Association just for a quick introduction.
Okay, thanks, Cathy. Welcome to the Homes by the Park consultation. As Cathy says, I'm Claire Malpass. I'm the Chief Exec of the Cassiltoun Group. Over the past 2 years, we've been consulting in a variety of ways with the local community at various events and activities. We've now reached the stage in the planning process where we need to formally consult on the project with you, the community. Normally, for any proposed development, we hold an open day and invite people to come along and hear about our plans. It's an opportunity to speak to the staff and particularly the design team and find out what parts of the designs are still to be finalised and can still be influenced by the needs and desires of you, the local community. However, due to COVID-19, for this development, we've had to do this in this virtual way, which I hope you find useful, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions. I'm now going to pass you back over to Cathy, who will, from Collective Architecture, he'll be leading on this project in the consultation.
That's great, thanks Claire. So I'm just going to pick up from where we left. Claire, if it's okay, would you mind turning your camera off then? We'll just switch around. Hopefully it's back to myself now. Yep, 2 seconds. Okay, thanks for that introduction, Claire. I thought it was worth covering who else we have in our team. So quite a few people involved. We also have landscape architects on our team, Rayburn, Farquhar, Bowen, who are going to do a presentation towards the end. Engineers, quantity surveyors, contractors, and energy consultants. So it's quite a big team that are involved. In addition, we also have a number of contributors that have helped us on the technical side in developing the proposals, and also people within the planning department and other areas as well. I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much. It's rather text heavy, which might be difficult to see in phones. However, I thought it was important to mention who was involved. Plus also the remainder of the presentation is very graphical, so hopefully lots of diagrams, photos, images, and a little clearer, and hopefully you can sit back and enjoy the presentation as we move forward. So some background information just to explain how this came about. In September 2017, Cassiltoun Housing Association received funding from Glasgow City Council to commission a feasibility study for the redevelopment of the former nursery site at Barlia Terrace in Castlemilk. Laura Edwards, as development consultant, oversaw the process with a design competition inviting teams of architects, engineers and quantity surveyors to present proposals. Collective Architecture were successful with Brown Wallace as cost consultants and G3 Group as structural engineers. A feasibility document was the principal output of this process, and this considered the range of opportunities at the site. It was also accompanied by a scaled model of the development, which has been on display in Cassiltoun Housing Association's foyer for the last year or so. So in late 2019, we were approached again by Cassiltoun as the board had approved the development of the study to the next stage. This was great news for us. It'd been an interesting site and we'd enjoyed exploring the opportunities through the consultation processes with the community and through the various studies. It was at this point that a landscape architect joined the team, and that was an incredibly important role as it would turn out. A principal comment from the planning department was to consider the landscape more closely and the unique opportunities that the site presents. The objective was housing should feel much more integrated, like it's within a park rather than beside a park. And the landscape architect is going to talk about this later in the presentation. So to give you a quick overview of what's proposed, there are two principal elements. There's the housing and there's a social enterprise and wellbeing centre proposed as part of the scheme. The housing side, we're exploring the possibility of up to 140 homes within the site. These will be a mix of tenures, affordable housing, private housing, and for different types of households, so families, young couples, elderly, people with restricted mobility, wheelchair accessible homes. The Social Enterprise and Wellbeing Centre is a key part of the proposal. This is a new building to allow Cassiltoun Housing Association to continue a lot of the good work that they already do, providing additional community space, facilities for horticultural workers, and to support other local organisations, for example, those involved in childcare and horticultural growing. So Cassiltoun are working hard behind the scenes to secure funding for this, and we would welcome any feedback on this also as part of this consultation. So here's what we know about the site. I thought it was useful to cover this. The site uniquely benefits from having one of the most distinctive and attractive parklands in Glasgow on its doorstep. Castlemilk Park contains some of the oldest trees in Glasgow and is part of a designed landscape of fish ponds, walkways, bridges, heritage trails and community artworks. The parkland is also a focal point for activities led by Cassiltoun Housing Association and others. The Housing Association is very active within their neighbourhood with a dedicated community development officer, a woodlands officer and a regeneration manager. The team successfully deliver an annual programme of events each year with the parkland as the principal venue for a lot of the activities such as wildflower walks, woodland strollers clubs, inspiring nature events, family fun days and festivals and various other things. Moving on to this aerial photograph, we can see how green this neighbourhood is and how close it is to existing neighbourhoods and local facilities. The site is located to the east end of Castlemilk and it's roughly about 3.8 hectares. It is bounded on the northwest by Barlia Terrace, a road that is partially pedestrianised with trees either side, and that's the white dotted line that you can see there. To the northeast is a neighbouring development, Barlia Way, and that's 3 and 4 storey apartment blocks built by Cassiltoun Housing Association in 2008, and that's represented by the circle there. And the remainder of the site is bounded by Cassiltoun Park. And at present, there are no formal pedestrian or vehicle routes of access to the site, although it's noted that local people will often use the site as a shortcut when going into the park, going to school or walking to local shops. The land is known to have been utilised by Glasgow City Council as a cultivation space for the growing of flora to decorate municipal parks and hanging baskets across the city. This has ceased within the last 20 years and the land has become overgrown. There are signs of antisocial behaviour, possibly in certain areas, and this is due to the location, the seclusion of the site. The majority of the site is bounded by a 2-metre high security palisade fence. And this is painted green, although it's been vandalised and has been partially repaired in places. The site is mostly Glasgow City Council owned, although there is a small corner which is owned by Cassiltoun Housing Association just next to the Barley Away development. So this is zooming out slightly, and I thought it was useful just to reflect on this also. Connections. So the site is served by a reasonably regular bus service to the city centre within a 10-minute walk from the site. There's also bus services along Arden Craig Road, and you have the nearest train station at Croftfoot. Local amenities, there are a number of schools nearby. So you have St Bartholomew's, Miller Primary School, Castlemilk Secondary. Castlemilk Shopping Precinct is a 10-minute walk from the site, and this includes a lot of your local amenities that you would be looking for in the neighbourhood. As well as that, we have the library, local health centre, there is a swimming pool, there is fitness facilities, Glasgow Club. And slightly further afield, you have the Cathkin Braes Country Park, and that's a substantial area of publicly accessible green space. At 199 hectares, it's substantial, and it is the venue for Glasgow's International Mountain Bike Trail. So the site is well served by a number of amenities. Cycling, we do have the National Cycle Network nearby, Route 756. This connects to East Kilbride and Rutherglen to the city centre. It's possible that that could be extended with a new branch to the Cathkin Braes, and this would run along Barley Terrace and connect to the wider areas. This is an opportunity that was identified in the feasibility study, so we are hoping to explore that further. And just a quick note on the topography, the overall levels of the site. The highest point is to the south, and then it falls gradually to the north. There are kind of localised level changes, for example, where there was once a historic walled garden, which is now demolished and out with the boundary. But it's definitely not a flat site. There are some areas that are quite steep as well. On the next few slides, we're going to focus on the history of the site and sort of fascinating backstory as to how this neighbourhood has been shaped over the years. The site itself occupies a prime position on the edge of Glasgow, elevated and prominently positioned with panoramic views across the city. And it's possibly these qualities that led to the very first development of this location. Research reveals that the site was once occupied by a castle on the crest of a hill, in amongst a landscape of trees with rolling hills. The Stuarts of Castlemilk acquired the castle in the 13th century, and it was to be developed and enlarged as a country mansion in the decades following. Then we move on to this aerial photograph, which we find quite useful. It was taken in 1931, just before World War II, at a time when the neighbourhoods were expanding. This was one of several planned estates within the city, responding to the need for good quality, affordable homes to house the workers of the city. In 1938, the remainder of the estate was acquired by the Glasgow Corporation, but the outbreak of the Second World War delayed a lot of the building work that you can see going on in these photographs. The mansion was to be used to accommodate evacuees from the city until the end of the war, then until 1968 as a children's home, until it then closed later in 1972, and it was around then that the house was demolished. A review of the historic plans also reveals that it has always been non-industrial use, so it has always been used as an estate. So the site benefits from having a rich and varied history, and the wealth of information available is significant. I'm going to skip through a few of the historic plans because we do actually have quite a few. A lot of this information will be available on the website if anyone wishes to jump back in and have another look. So starting at 1864, this is our oldest plans with early signs of development taking place. 1896, a lot of the key features are available, such as the fish ponds and the bridges. Another photo from 1896, but this has a little bit more detail. In particular, it's interesting to see the ice house surrounded by clusters of other buildings. You can see here an orchard, walled gardens and greenhouses. So there's a lot going on within the site boundary itself. And then in 1910, the subdivision of the site is visible. We can see the paths and the connections more clearly in this plan. And then 1939, so this was the start of the Second World War, still a very green site. But in 1953, if you look at the walled garden here, you start to see there's a lot more going on within the site. And there's further greenhouses and other development happening. So this is quite an interesting plan. And it does suggest, with all of the growing going on in the site, and the fact that this was taking place just after the war, whether this may have coincided with rationing or some other activities. So there is quite a diverse history to the site. And then the next one, 1959, this is actually where we start to see the new homes appearing nearby. So it's quite a lot of information available, and capturing this rich and varied history has happened in a number of ways. So there has been archaeological digs led by the community. There's been books published, items salvaged, for example, the fireplaces of Cassiltoun House. And there's exhibitions and items on permanent display in Castle Housing Association's foyer as well, which everyone can pop in and have a look once the restrictions are lifted, obviously. The level of interest is also significant. So we have the Cassiltoun History Facebook page with well over 1,000 pictures, quite an impressive back catalogue of information. It's arranged in 148 folders and it's uploaded by the members of the public, and it's continuing to grow as a fantastic resource and archive for Castlemilk. The history of the site has been a primary consideration for us in the development of the proposals. And it's in this plan, this annotated plan, that we start to pick out some of the key features of the site that we're hoping to pick up on in the development of the proposals. Heritage is important, and we have consulted West of Scotland Archaeology Service, who are part of the planning department, and they have been approached for their input as well, so we can see them becoming more involved as the proposals developed. And importantly, there's the natural heritage of the site. It is presented within the park itself. The park itself is a designed landscape of pathways and bridges, diverse and exotic species of trees, some of the oldest in Glasgow. And there's the legacy of William Gilchrist, the person who actually planted a lot of these trees and planned the park. And the landscape architect is going to pick up on this in their presentation, because I think there is so much we can learn from when we celebrate and look at the trees that are there within the park itself. So moving forward, just the next slide. We have sought to reference the rich history as a primary influence in the development of the proposals. So, for example, architectural forms, the walled garden, the stables, is it possible to echo this within the design of housing, courtyards, or the streetscape? The design landscapes, as we mentioned there, acknowledging the role of William Gilchrist. Respecting the boulevard of trees along Barlia Way, or Barlia Terrace, symbolically important is the principal arrival to Cassiltoun House. How do the buildings engage with this frontage, considering also the hierarchy of streets and how to enhance this principal route with improved overlooking, safer and more pleasant routes to walk along. Ideas of a self-sustaining estate, so this idea of orchards, vegetable gardens, ponds, stables, providing food, water, transportation and shelter, mirrored in the proposals with warm homes, local employment opportunities and food growing. Sustainability is going to be a paramount consideration moving forward. And then moving on to the ecology, this is also an important consideration. With such vibrant green landscapes nearby, it's understandable that this diverse ecosystem is likely to have evolved over the years. An ecological survey was commissioned with Parnassus Ecology. This included a desktop study, phase 1 habitat survey, and some preliminary species surveys, so looking at bats and badgers. A few of the key points to note, the site does have an intricate mosaic of habitats as described in the report. So that includes semi-improved natural grassland, tall ruderal vegetation, bramble, raspberry, tree scrub, significant areas of semi-natural woodland. So it's important. Did look at the potential for the trees in terms of wildlife, and in particular bats and birds. 39 of the 600 or so trees seem to have had some potential for bat roosting, so that needs to be looked at, and that is something that we're considering. But fundamentally, the study did conclude that the site is of local importance in terms of wildlife and contributes much to the conservation of wildlife interests within the adjacent site of importance for nature conservation. So that includes Castlemilk Glen, Kingsburn and Glenwood. And on to the next slide. This is a great photograph from one of the studies carried out. This was the protected species investigations. The trail camera survey work carried out in partnership with Cassiltoun's own woodlands officer and the local community identified signs of roe deer, foxes and badgers on or directly adjacent to the site. Active badger sets were found within 100 metres of the site, but nothing actually within the site itself. Other considerations, no bat roosts were found, although it was recommended that anyone working here was given a talk on how to identify any, so that's something we need to bear in mind. Bird nesting we do need to consider, that's the same for most sites that you would develop in the city. No badger sets were found, as I'd mentioned, but the site is actually used for foraging. So there's a few things we can do during the development phase just to make sure that badgers are protected and that any impacts are reduced. So, yeah, there's a lot to consider, lots of technicalities that we will be looking at as we're moving forward. But we do see the wildlife very much as an asset. It's something that's very positive about the site. We've really realised that through a lot of the consultation that we've done. It is an asset, and we do want this to be a key focus moving forward. So moving on to the next slide, this is just a few diagrams that we developed at feasibility stage, just exploring the opportunities. With the large amount of trees nearby, we looked at this idea of the courtyards and creating little pocket areas within the development. We looked at the location of certain buildings as well, so where we might position a public building within the overall development. We looked at solar considerations, so thinking very carefully about overshadowing, but how to make the most of the solar aspect of the site and thinking about the hierarchy of spaces as well. And then importantly, we looked at pedestrian movement, again, another important consideration. And we know through consultation and through a lot of our observations that this is important, the pedestrian movement and how people move around. In this diagram, we're looking at the routes in and around, so routes to school, routes to shops, how people connect with local transport. The routes on the perimeter obviously are important, but we are noticing desire lines in some areas as well, so people taking shortcuts. So it's very important for us to understand that, because obviously in developing the proposals, we want to make sure that we are developing the proposals in such a way that allows pedestrian movement to continue to happen in quite a sort of managed way. Likewise, thinking about vehicles as well, it's an important consideration with any development here. The challenge we have is the levels mainly, because it isn't a flat site, so we have to think about how you could actually integrate a road within this development and integrate it in a sensitive way. At one point we were asked to look at the range of options for vehicle access, for example from Arden Craig Road, but that was quickly ruled out just because that would have taken a route through the park itself, and we know the park is a very sort of precious and valuable asset of that neighbourhood, so we didn't want to do anything to disturb that. So we have been looking at that very carefully and looking at the options moving forward. So our approach was really just to keep it as simple as possible, having one way in, one way out, and a very simple circuit of roads. This was our kind of very early layout at feasibility stage, where we were creating these sort of areas of courtyards and connections. And you can see just in red there, the public building. So the idea was to try and keep that to the corner, to the public edge, as close as possible to the sort of busiest corner, and also close to Cassiltoun Housing Association, where they have their stables just slightly further along in Machrie Road. So moving on to the next stage, and this was our sort of feasibility stage layout, still very highly conceptual here, but you can start to see, you know, a lot of these ideas in visual form around sort of character areas and neighbourhoods. So we're starting to identify opportunities for sort of village greens, pocket parks, thinking about creating our own avenue of trees almost to mirror what we have in Barley Terrace at the moment, but with new trees. So this was a kind of very first layout and thinking about how we might develop this. And we have been looking to government guidance, best practice approaches, Designing for Streets. That's a document that's published by the Scottish Government, which considers the sort of street design and ease of movement. So certain things we'd be looking to do, such as making sure spaces are well overlooked to ensure they feel safe and pleasant. Thinking about what we can do to create a welcoming development, so taking this public building and positioning that on the corner as the kind of sort of gateway feature. And thinking about the longer term aspects of this as well, you know, that it is resource efficient. For example, looking at the possibility of introducing electric car charging as part of this as well. So feasibility stage, we did explore a number of layouts, a number of sort of realignments to suit different efficiencies and orientation. We also thought about building forms. This is one of our earliest hand sketches just along the top here, where we were exploring the spaces between buildings and what they might feel like. And you can get a feel for what we're looking at. Everything is quite kind of low rise, and the idea is to try and integrate as much as possible. And on this next slide, we actually started to look at the detail of building plans as well. In particular, we were drawn to these simple geometric forms of the stables building itself, and I've shown some examples there on the right, you know, of how you might interpret those sort of gable-like forms in the design of a new development. So moving on, I'd quite like to just talk about the Social Enterprise and Wellbeing Centre. Again, that's a really important part of the proposals and another fantastic opportunity for this development. Cassiltoun Housing Association are currently investigating opportunities for external grant assistance to develop this building. It's to serve two principal purposes. The first is a base for Cassiltoun Housing Association's maintenance team, as they did have a previous study that identified a need for a new building, and this was one of the options to commission a new purpose-built facility, but also to serve the community, so allowing Cassiltoun Housing Association to further develop their busy programme of events and activities with a range of sort of multi-purpose rooms, and also working with other organisations locally to look at how they might use the rooms within this building as well. An important point to note, the Social Enterprise and Wellbeing Centre is moving forward to a different timescale from the housing. So it's likely we'd see the housing move first, and then hopefully, subject to funding and various other considerations, the Social Enterprise and Wellbeing Centre will follow. And this slide, I won't dwell on it too much because actually this was from the feasibility stage, but on the left there you can see the accommodation schedule, and that gives you a feel for the type of spaces that we were looking at. Although moving forward, Cassiltoun had actually been in touch with other organisations, other stakeholders, and had invited them along to look at opportunities. So for example, we were in touch with an organisation that has an outdoor forest nursery. They were looking for a base, so this building was potentially an opportunity. And also in touch with a local after-school group, potentially providing space for out-of-hours care for children and activities and various other things. So yeah, in some ways the brief has expanded, but if anything, it has led to new ideas and new proposals. And in particular in this next slide, here we can see this is a sort of concept image of what the building might look like, but what this shows is actually the outdoors is as important as indoors as well, and this is where working with the landscape architect has been quite interesting, looking at opportunities for spaces for outdoor gatherings, community food growing and natural play. So there's a few ideas starting to evolve specific to the Social Enterprise and Wellbeing Centre. So moving on, this is where I'm going to talk about the proposals and where we are now. But I think at this point, it's a good point to note in this presentation. Actually, we do have a Q&A feature as part of this presentation. So somewhere on your screen, either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're using, you should see the option for Q&A. And if you have anything you wish to ask or any comments at all, if you could just note them down in the Q&A, and we'll either run through them during the presentation, depending on the nature of the question, or we'll pick up on them at the end. And I do have a colleague in the background that's monitoring these as we speak. And depending on the questions as well, is the option to upvote. So if you see someone else asking a question, you can do a thumbs up and that will bring the question up to the top, and we'll obviously prioritise that, so that's important. And yeah, I think just one minor caveat is we're relying on this technology, so hopefully this Q&A feature is useful. We're certainly going to try and answer all questions, and there is the option to email us directly, and you'll see I have actually noticed this on quite a few slides here. If you email us at comments@homesbythepark.com, we're also keeping an eye on that email address throughout the event if anyone wishes to provide comments. So back to the presentation, that was just a quick note on procedure. Moving forward, it was very important for us to respond to the planning comments because there were sort of 4 key comments raised towards the end of the feasibility study that we were keen to address. Number 1, it was recommended that we employ a landscape architect. This was to ensure that the key features, wildlife corridors, tree protection was suitably designed, and that's what we've done. We've now got a landscape architect on our team. Secondly, it was proposed that the amount of open space be increased. So we were looking to widen garden areas and improve clearances, and that's what we've done. There was a request that additional trees be retained. So that's something that we are looking at very carefully. The trees are an important feature visually, but also in terms of local wildlife. So that is something that we have looked at moving forward. And finally, we also were asked to look at cars. There was a lot of hard surfaces and roads in the very early proposal, which obviously they are necessary, but it is a lot of hard surfacing for a development that is supposed to integrate within what is quite a natural context. So to look at ways in which we could make that sort of more efficient and more sustainable as a whole. So that is something that we are considering with the client team and with input from the roads department as well. And then we were left with the overarching comment. I've mentioned this just at the start. So it should look like housing within a park rather than housing beside the park. And that's really what this diagram is about, is to show how the park and the new development can integrate together side by side. So what followed was a very busy exercise, and this is what we've been doing for the last couple of months, a lot of sketching and technical analysis involving both the landscape architect and the engineer working side by side to consider the issues. We can see in some of these diagrams the specifics of levels considerations, tree positions, very important, how we're dealing with surface water management as well, and the design of fronts and backs. So there's been a lot going on. We did have a review of the tree survey. In fact, we went back out. That was a further tree survey was organised. And in particular, we were looking at some of these sort of very dense corners, because you can see from this plan here, with the circles depicting the trees, that there are some areas, particularly around the edge, where it is very dense. Those kind of light green areas are where we have large areas of shrubs. We actually got the surveyor back out to try and pinpoint a little bit more accurately some of the features within those areas, and that has been very useful for us, so we can learn more about the trees and what we can keep. And the landscape architect, I think, is going to pick up on this a bit more in their presentation. And you can see, just to give you an idea of the level of detail, so a big part of this has been looking at how we can take our pathways and our roads and position them so that they meander and wind through the development rather than through areas of important trees. So this diagram in particular, we were looking at how to form a connection to Barlia Terrace whilst minimising any impact on the trees as a whole. So that's the level of detail we're at the moment. And this very colourful diagram, this is this reflects one of our key challenges, which is the levels of the site. The site falls from a sort of high point in the southwest to a low point in the northeast, where the walled garden once stood. The level changes are significant and could require retaining walls in places. Although this is in the context of retained trees whose roots would need to be carefully measured, as we can't dig down around trees, nor can we pile soil on top. So we have to work as closely as possible to the existing leaves. And what you see here is what we call a cut and fill diagram. So the red is where we're digging down, the blue is where we're sort of building up, and the green is the existing levels. So our strategy here is to try and make it all green, because we really do want to work as closely as possible to the existing levels so we can retain as many trees as possible. And finally, this is the overall site layout. This is where we've arrived at the moment. And just to explain, and I'll just use my cursor here. So we have a single loop road that comes in and out of the site. This has the advantage of no reversing, which we think is particularly useful if you're designing a development for families and children. So bin lorries can come in and out without having to reverse. That's very important. This route that you see here, it has been carefully chosen to try and avoid trees where possible. These red lines that you see are the protection areas and the trees themselves, the darker colours being the sort of category A, the very important trees, and the slightly lighter greens sort of category B, but they're all very important. So we have looked at ways to integrate. We still have the social enterprise centre at the entrance here, which we still think is the best location, so that keeps all of the public traffic to this corner. And then we've thought about routes for pedestrians, safer routes, pedestrian prioritised environments. So thinking about how people might walk from Barlia Terrace at the top here through to the park itself. So there are continuous routes. And what we've ended up with are these sort of fingers of green that reach out into the park area and form these connections. So as soon as you cross this edge, Castlemilk Park is around this edge here. You would be actually within the park once you cross this boundary. So that's something that we're looking at very carefully. And as well as the existing trees, we're also looking at new trees as well, and types of trees that would be suitable for this development. It's also worth noting that this is going to be phased, even housing, potentially 2 phases, looking at developing this sort of inner loop area here first, and these homes here, and the homes along this edge. That would be our phase 1, and that would be mostly affordable. That would be affordable housing, so that would be led by Cassiltoun Housing Association. And then along the park edge, we have identified opportunities for potentially private housing, and that will follow as a subsequent phase, but a lot of that will depend on the sort of markets, the housing market at the time. We may look at changing that back to affordable or the other way, depending on how we get on with that. So the next image, so yeah, this is an image that we keep coming back to, and you'll have seen this already in the presentation, as we feel that this image does capture the sort of overall intent. And I suppose to summarise, the intent is to sensitively integrate amongst the trees. That's very important. Create desirable homes, places where people would want to live. That's very important too. And importantly, respecting the local context, so allowing routes through and allowing for wildlife and nature to continue to thrive. So this is our sort of summary image in terms of the proposal development. So I'm going to hand over to the landscape architect for the next slides. So if you just bear with me a second. Ian, I don't know if you want to join us now.
Yep, I think that should be me on now.
Right.
Yeah, I'm Ian Lyon. I am project landscape architect on this project. A project that we're really excited to be involved in. Fine. Yes, and it's all started for us when our involvement was following feasibility stage, and the idea that they wanted to have a landscape architect involved. And of course, from our perspective, we recognised that it was a large site with lots of trees on the site, and therefore there was going to be lots of consideration to be required to address the number of trees that are on the site. I'll just see if I can, yeah, if we go on the next image. So that it was going back to this idea of the concept of being housing within a woodland park rather than beside one. And this has been quite a consistent theme that's gone through in the presentation, which has been really fun and enjoyable to be part of. But some people have asked us, well, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? And I think on the next slide, we've got indeed what it looks like. And this is an example of a site that's in, I think it's in Alloa, which picks up on existing trees on which they've managed to forge some areas for housing to go in with. Now you can see the scale of these existing trees are at least 2 to 3 times the size of the houses. But you can also perhaps notice the fact that the number of them is actually quite limited, because you don't need that many fabulous trees to make a space look good. If you get lots and lots, then fantastic, but actually having just the right trees can actually really enhance what we have. So as part of what we have done is we have first of all said, right, well, we need to interrogate the tree survey. Let me just check, it's going to go to the next slide. Yeah, so we've got this issue of what, when you can't see the wood for the trees. And if you've ever visited the site, you'll realise how dense it is in some areas of existing trees. And it's really difficult to assess what's good and what's bad. But we've had obviously 2 tree surveys carried out, one of which was an update to the original. And we've taken that information and analysed it as best we can. It turns out there are actually 300 trees within the site boundary. And I think within the proximity of 10 metres from the boundary, there's about 600 in total. So there's a heck of a lot of trees on site that we need to look at. But the good thing about the surveys that are carried out, they look at the size in terms of height and spread of each tree, what type of tree it is, its structural condition, and just as importantly, what its life expectancy is going to be. And it allows us to assess of what's going to be good in terms of the long-term strategy for the site. One of the things as we've looked at is then taking that information and then trying to define it into categories in terms of what are the best trees on the site and what trees are dangerous or of poor condition and need to be taken out. And also the unfortunate trees that we have to lose, because for us to have development and have roads in on the site, then we need to unfortunately lose some of these trees. So the idea is that we've obviously got the good, the bad and the necessary, and then on the likes of the one on the left is one of the existing giant redwoods that are on the site, which is probably one of the largest trees, I think, in the overall site. But then there's also the other side of it, which is the tree in the middle, which is a kind of key sycamore tree that's in the middle, but it has undergone quite significant amount of fire damage during the course. There's also some structural damage, and there's a general view, having had lots of analysis done on this tree, that actually the best thing that we can do for the longevity of the site is actually to have this to be removed. And then we've got the likes of the trees on the right, which are some of the trees in the groups that we're having to look at in order to facilitate the road access. And we've got a couple of these, and we've just tried to allow ourselves consideration of trying to maintain the best of trees and sacrificing as few as possible. So we go back to this classic image of the housing within a woodland park. And as Kathy says, this really does pick up exactly what we've tried to achieve, where actually there's been quite a light touch in terms of bringing the architectural elements into the park and actually make it feel part of what we've got. And then by doing this, what we then start to create is a series of spaces. So it's spaces for people, some of these open public spaces where we're going to have a mixture of the existing trees, new trees, and lots of new planting as well. So we want it to be quite a lush space, sorry. And it's not just places for people, but it's also about thinking about the overall, oops, let me just jump back. Just excuse me 1 second. We've also got thinking in terms of the social enterprise and wellbeing centre, that we may have spaces for community growing and that kind of level of interaction. And this is all stuff that can be incorporated within the spaces that we have. There's also thinking about considering the landscape as both functional and attractive. And when I say functional, some of these zones of planting that we've got here are actually part of rain gardens, which have been coordinated as part of the engineer's design and our design to actually deal with some of the drainage system. And we think this is a much better way to actually deal with things, because not only does it deal with the rainwater problem, but actually it provides you with quite an attractive setting, which is after all what we're after. There's also then thinking about some of these green fingers that Kathy alluded to earlier on, which is these areas between some of the housing terraces that actually link right across to the existing woodland that is around. So these paths, like the one on the left, will actually effectively extend beyond the housing line and into the park. So actually it creates the integration where in some ways the park is coming into the site, but in other ways that the housing development is starting to extend beyond this. And this is where this homes by the park comes from. So in terms of how these spaces could be used, we've had quite a passion as a practice about thinking about edible landscapes and the joy that they bring. And also it's very useful from the point of view of actually trying to have different age groups. There's no kind of specific demographic of older people, younger people, but actually the ability to connect these groups together in terms of actually fun landscapes for growing, for their own purpose, but also for education as well. And we found these quite useful. So we've incorporated the suggestions of having sort of allotment type community growing spaces, but also incorporating things like fruiting elements, orchard trees, fruiting hedges, etc., that actually can add to that level. And then there's the other fun part of it, which is probably one of my preferred points, is actually the playful landscapes of it, and actually trying to think about things beyond the standard kind of kit fence and carpet type play areas, but actually the incidental equipment that exists. And there's here some examples of things like small trampolines, how some elements that provide the edges to paths can actually become playful elements, and also taking into consideration the contingents of younger people who want to use bikes and scooters, etc. But also utilising more natural materials as part of this equipment. And you can see here in this image on the right, actually, this is a series of kind of balance beams made with a series of logs and planks. And these are kind of fed in between the trees. And this is exactly the character that we're trying to achieve. And we could include things like slides, just for something that's completely different. But you can also see how we've got examples of little wayfinding signs that are actually quite quirky, quite interesting, and could prove quite fun as community projects, and to add a real richness to the site. Again, some other examples of simple tunnel structures, and even things like trees that have fallen down, actually repositioning them and having these as kind of temporary or semi-temporary play equipment. Obviously, trees that have fallen like this may over time actually start to rot and everything else, but at least it will provide a certain level of play value in the interim. And then some of the other great examples of how these have been expanded to use kind of balancing logs, etc. So there's lots of fun things that we can do, and we're quite keen that these become part of almost like a big trail within the park. So it's not a defined central play area, but it becomes a playful landscape where everybody benefits from it. It's not just within one corner. And then there's all the other fun stuff, things like bug hotels and little kind of willow or branch dens that can be formed, lots of fun things that we can incorporate. And these could be extended into the park as part of other works and stuff, but just to give a real richness to the overall development. A few more hammocks and swings. I mean, the possibilities are endless. Quite a few of the play companies that we've been involved in actually like to use the existing trees as initial structures, and it's just working from them. So we really do want to make sure that the existing trees that we are retaining, that they provide as much a benefit for the site as possible. A few other willow tunnels, etc. And then this is actually the updated model, which Kathy referred to right at the start of the presentation. And this was, I think, completed a few weeks ago, but it really shows a real richness to how the woodland kind of ties into the development. So I believe that's now available within Cassiltoun's stables building, and should be available for view soon. So the real question is, how can you guys help? Well, we had a consultation event a couple of weeks ago where we were actually presenting some of these schemes and also coming up with lots of ideas. And I think it is important that we need your ideas, because it's important to forge the community's ideas into the scheme, and really push it forward. And I think that'll allow you, Kathy, to move on to the next stage.
Okay, thanks, Ian. I'll just rejoin. If you wouldn't mind just muting and turn your camera off, and hopefully it's back to me. Okay then, so just to pick up on the consultation, we have been keeping an eye on Q&A, and everyone's been really kind. There's been no questions, but that's not to say that we haven't had some good feedback. So just bear with me a second. I'll share the screen again. Right, so hello again. I'm just sharing the screen, so 2 seconds. Right, so back to the presentation. Yes, we have had some events already, as Ian mentioned there. We had an event outdoors there on the 9th of September, which Cassiltoun Housing Association supported us with. It was just outside the stables, and we managed to catch some people. It was about 3 o'clock. We managed to catch some people just on their way back from school and picking up the kids, and that was quite useful, and we did gather feedback in a number of ways. We had the models, we had some questionnaires, but we've also been using these postcards, which have actually been sent out with Cassiltoun's newsletter recently, and we are getting some feedback. There is a prize draw there for postcards returned. Before this event, we thought it'd be quite useful to look at some of the feedback we've had so far. So Cassiltoun did have a look in the box there. And there's a few key themes starting to emerge. So this idea of protecting nature, and some of the suggestions we've had in the postcards, this idea of bringing in new trees, plants, vegetable gardens, wildlife corridors. So some of those ideas we've looked at already, but certainly hearing local people talk about this as something that we're wanting to explore. Some ideas about introducing benches in community gardens. In particular, that is something that we could possibly look at around about the social enterprise and wellbeing centre, and there are a few areas within the housing areas themselves that we could develop for that as well. Information boards on the sort of history of the site. So it's something we knew at the beginning, that there is a lot of interest locally in the history of the site. So is there anything that we can do physically within the proposals just to pick up on that as well? Adventure and play equipment was mentioned, and it was quite nice to see Ian's slides there. So some of those ideas that we could take forward. Practical considerations, parking needs to be looked at. And this idea about cleanliness as well, keeping the streets clean, that is something that we find coming up in most developments now. We do need to think about maintenance longer term, so that development looks as good in day one as it does 5 years later. So that's very important. In addition to the postcards, some of the other feedback. So this is actually some feedback from the questionnaires, where people went into a bit more detail about what they're looking for. So there was discussions around natural light, this idea of mental health and well-being and the importance of natural light, and so that was quite interesting. I don't know if a lot of that comes from sort of lockdown considerations and the fact that people have been very restricted in terms of their access to the outdoors. So that's something that we picked up on. People talking about front gardens, a lot of kind of divided opinions in that. So some people saying keep front gardens open and no fences, and some people saying no, actually we do need fences, they need to be segregated. So it's quite interesting to hear opinions both ways, and that's something that we will look at moving forward. There's a lot going on in Castlemilk, so there were a few comments just on new developments generally across the area. There's a lot of house builders in the area developing new homes, and a lot of strong opinions developing there, and that's okay. I mean, I think for us, the feedback that we got was to think about referencing the current character of the area, so looking to existing neighbourhood forms, maybe starting to reference slightly more traditional building forms. So that's something that we could look at. Again, the practicalities around heating bills, it's quite interesting to hear that coming up, but that is something that we'll look at. People asking, well, big windows, surely that means bigger heating bills, but not necessarily. That is something, you obviously get solar gain, and there's other opportunities there, so that is something that we would look at. People talking about opportunities for composting as well. I think that general awareness of the importance of composting, can we accommodate that within the development? And then sort of general questions around tenure. People are wanting to know what's for sale and what's for rent. That is the one thing we have to caveat at the moment, because we don't know. It will really come down to the housing market at the time of development, but we know Cassiltoun are really keen to develop homes for affordable, on the basis of affordability, providing different options. So that's quite important as well. And then just to pick up on some comments on the landscaping and comments on the park itself. Within the park, there's some issues of litter and fly tipping, a lot of broken glass. This is actually an issue that we picked up on a recent meeting with the steering group. It's a group of volunteers, a steering group for Cassiltoun Park, and it's something they're aware of too. So what can be done to address that? Looking at the ponds as well, very important, but they are silting up. Is there anything that can be done here? The trees, lots of them, but there's feelings that they're maybe overgrown in certain areas, so that is a concern for some. Problems with graffiti and vandalism, and I suppose that comes, with any area where you have these sort of secluded spots, slightly hidden areas, but that is a concern for some people. Planting of new trees as desired, so it's nice to hear that, and that is something that we are looking at. Play area for all ages, so health and well-being generally, young and elderly, equally important. So that's something we'll look at is those opportunities. Generally more equipment for young children desired, so that's something we can look at. More information in the history of the park, mentioned that already, but that's come up again in the surveys. And there are some hopes there for the established trees, any that we're not able to keep, that we can replant or in some ways make use of the wood in the creation of new features. And finally, just that last point, encouraging people to grow their own. So growing vegetables, how do you encourage that within a neighbourhood context? And, obviously as architects and landscape architects, we can think about that in terms of the design of gardens. So that's just some of the feedback that I thought I would cover just now. I'm just going to have a quick look. I don't believe we have any questions or answers, and that's absolutely fine, because on the website we do have further information. We will be uploading these slides, so if you've missed anything, if you want to have a look at anything again, you can jump on and have a look and zoom in and look at all the detail. But importantly, we also have the survey as well. I was planning on covering this today, but just to give you an idea of some of the themes. So one of our survey looks at the park itself. It's really important that we understand the park, given the proximity and the fact that we are trying to form new connections. So there are questions around how people use the park at the moment, how often, for what reason. Is it for leisure? Is it for health? Is it for going to school or if we're going to the shops. That's quite important for us to understand, and how they feel about the park. Is it safe? Could it do with better lighting? Anything like that. That's something that we're hoping to capture in the survey. We do have some questions on the heritage side as well. So how do you actually reflect that within the development of a new neighbourhood? There's some really nice features that we know of from looking at the heritage of the area, the likes of the walled gardens, the ice house, the bridges, the various other things. Can we incorporate that somehow in the development of the proposals? And what aspects of the heritage should we be looking to reference? That's something that we are seeking some input on. And I've mentioned here edible landscapes. That is something, with the walled garden and with a lot of the work the landscape architects doing, we would be looking to explore that in the development of the proposals. And finally, we had the ideas tree. So this was a feature at the physical consultation that we had. And that was just looking for some ideas on how to reuse the wood of the old sycamore tree. So it's a nice big tree in the middle of the site that unfortunately we're not able to keep. It has been heavily vandalised and fire damaged. So we are looking at, well, what can we do with that tree in terms of new uses? There's some suggestions there. And we are putting it to people. What do you think? What would you like to see us do with the old tree? So we're just coming to the end here. So this is where we are in terms of the current site layout. Absolutely, we're looking for feedback. If anyone has any comments on what they see here or anything that we've said today, we obviously want to hear from you. And I'll just end on this last slide. So this is just a screenshot of the website. So you can see here, we have a lot of information. Some of the images you've seen already, but there's the feasibility study. There's a lot of the kind of heritage research we've done, information in the ecology side, information in the proposals. And again, it's worth a visit. If you have any comments, feel free to use the surveys. Feel free to leave your details as well. We do have a keeping in touch page if anyone wants to leave their email address. And we also have the direct email address. So any direct comments, they can be put to us at comments@homesinthepark.com. Okay, so just to finish there, I'd just like to thank everyone for those that made it along, and for the panellists who have kindly come along and assisted in the development of the presentation. I did say at the beginning that we would put the presentation on loop, but I think it's probably just as useful just to put it on the website, and then that means people can obviously browse through their leisure. So that is something that we'll organise. And an important point to note as well, there is a planning application to be lodged for this. Is towards the end of the year. As part of that planning application, we will be producing a report, and the purpose of that report is to capture a lot of the feedback from consultation events. And we are making a point of any questions raised during consultations. We are going to try and answer them individually, and we would be posting those responses within the next week or so on the website. So if anyone wants to see how we're getting on, please visit the website where you'll find some updates. And when it comes to planning stage, that's when we hope to have everything finalised, and there will be the opportunity to also make some formal comments to the planning department too, if you wish. So I'll just leave it at that. So thank you very much for coming along. Yeah, by all means, please do get in touch then. Okay, thank you.